Hello, everyone. Welcome to IPWatchdog Unleashed, where each week we journey into the world of intellectual property to discuss the laws, news, policy, and politics of innovation, technology, and creativity. With analysis and commentary from industry thought leaders and newsmakers from around the world, IPWatchdog Unleashed is hosted by world-renowned patent attorney and the founder of IPWatchdog.com, Quinn, who has twice been named one of the most influential people in the intellectual property community and recognized numerous times as one of the top IP strategists in the world. Take it away, Gene.
Thanks, Renee, and welcome everyone to this week's edition of IPWatchdog Unleashed. This week, I'm talking with my good friend, Matteo Sabattini. Matteo and I have been friends for many years. We've done the conference circuit together. We bumped into each other many a time. And it's good to see you, my friend. We don't see you nearly enough now that you've moved back to Italy, but any excuse to have a conversation with you is a good one in my book. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Gene. It's great to see you, and thanks for having me.
Sure. So now, the last time we sat down formally for something like this, you were somewhere else. So maybe catch us up to speed and let us know where you're at currently and maybe what you're doing. And then from there, maybe we can go into how you got there and that sort of thing. But where are you right now?
So in March of last year, I rejoined a company called Sisvel. Sisvel is a leader in the administration and formation of patent pools. And the reason I decided to rejoin it is really the work that the current CEO, Matteo Sabattini, is doing in growing the organization and moving it to be really a leader in the space has been really inspirational. Sisvel remains a relatively small company. We're 100 employees right now, but the impact that we have and the work that we do, people think that we're actually hundreds of people. And that was, as I said, inspirational and motivational to rejoin an organization that I actually had worked for more than a decade ago. And I'm very happy to be back. And Sisvel seems to be happy to have me back.
They do, from everything I can see, and they'd be silly not to be happy to have you back. Well, I think very highly of you, not only as a friend, but also as one of the thought leaders in this industry. And I always tell Renee, I was like, Matteo is my smartest friend. I mean, he knows all these issues, and you're a PhD in electrical engineering on top of that, right?
I am, yes, but I think you're setting listeners' expectations a little too high. Huh?
No. You are the real deal, and I really appreciate you being here. And I know you spent about a decade at Ericsson, and before that, you were at Sisvel and went from Sisvel to Ericsson. So you've come full circle here. Let's take a step back and work our way forward to where you are now with Sisvel. How did you get involved in intellectual property in the first place?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was reflecting on that recently. I decided to, at some point, do research mainly as my work. I did my dissertation, my Italian dissertation, in the German Aerospace Center in Germany on satellite communications, and that motivated me to apply for a PhD in the US with a professor that I had met in the past, also in wireless communications. And I think that was a great decision because I really learned so much through that process with that professor, and motivated me in keeping really close to technology and high tech. But then at some point I realized that I was just a lousy researcher, or maybe I was a lazy researcher, and I didn't really like the academic environment of focusing on one research topic very deeply with all your energy. And quite randomly, I landed an internship with a firm that was doing some technical analysis of patents. And I really liked it. I really liked the fact that I was actually working closely with brilliant inventors, with brilliant engineers, much more brilliant than me, in fields that were still close to what I studied, but still diverse enough to keep me interested. So that was the first step. And then from there, I just moved on and forward, more on the business side of transactions, becoming more and more involved in licensing, and then becoming more involved in policy. Actually, I started my policy work when I was at Sisvel the first time, because I thought that one of the things that was missing in the policy debate was the presence of practitioners. There were very few people which had real world experience in how the licensing markets function and had a voice in policy. I think nowadays things have shifted. We see more and more licensing manager, licensing executives that get involved in policy discussions, in discussions with regulators, and that's a good thing, right? Back in the days was a bit too academic, I would say, in the approach, and that's what motivated me to move more into the policy space. And that's where I am. Yes, I've been around the block. I was with Ericsson. I've been with InterDigital, and now I'm back at Sisvel. And as I said, very happy to be back.
It's been great to watch you go through all of this, because I do think you were in some ways a pioneer on the policy front, like you're saying, because there was, well, let me take a step back. As I've shared with you and we've talked many times, is I think not enough patent owners of all sizes get involved in the policy side, because they seem to have this old world view. An old world meaning like from 20 years ago when things were running smoothly and in my opinion, much better, that things are going to work themselves out. Everybody has to be in favor of patent system. You have to be in favor of innovation. You have to realize what the patent system does for innovation. And we don't need to get involved because cooler minds will prevail. And fast forward 20 years, people didn't get involved. And here we are now. And now it's like, well, how did this happen? And it happened because the side that was the implementing side, who they're patent owners themselves, but they largely are implementers, decided that they were going to go on a full court policy press and convince people of their positions. And they were extraordinarily successful. So I think when I think back, I think of you as sort of the pioneer in this. And you had some good companies you were working for, Sisvel, InterDigital, Ericsson, who gave you the runway to be able to involve yourself in these conversations in ways that unfortunately I think a lot of others weren't. Is that fair to say? And I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but I think the industry as a whole just didn't do enough as things were going wrong.
I take a slightly different view of this. And let me explain where I come from. It is very expensive to develop successful technologies, while it's relatively inexpensive to use these technologies. Right? Take a standard like 5G or Wi-Fi. It requires a lot of investments to develop those technologies, while to implement those technologies is relatively cheap in the sense that there is fierce competition in the market on those who actually develop or use this technology, which is ultimately what those who develop the technology want, right? Is broad adoption. But this brings an imbalance when it comes to policy in the sense that there is a numerosity problem. The companies investing in developing new technologies are inevitably outnumbered by companies who actually use these technologies. And so I think part of the reason that you hear more from those implementing the technologies than from those developing the technologies is simply a number issue. There are way more voices on the side of those implementing these technologies. The other fact in this debate is the fact that many of the innovation developers are not consumer-facing companies. Like take InterDigital, Ericsson, Sisvel, the companies that I worked for. They're not consumer-facing. Ericsson has a product business in the base station. InterDigital, the product is R&D. Sisvel, we're in the business of intermediaries between licensees and licensors. But we don't have a direct connection with consumers. While a lot of the companies that do use technologies that we develop, that innovators develop, are consumer-facing. And therefore, it's far easier to pass some policy messages to their consumers that eventually can have an impact on regulators as well. While it's far more difficult for a company that doesn't have that channel to be heard broadly. So again, I don't want to comment on specific companies getting involved in policy or not. Those are decisions that each company take individually, but that's certainly a problem that I have faced in the work that I've done in policy. Take any request for comments by the USPTO. The USPTO gets flooded by responses by those generally advocating for certain changes in the patent system to help the use of the technology and the implementation of the technology, simply because there aren't enough voices on the other side of the equation to be able to respond to that numerosity. The other factor to keep in mind is that policy and advocacy work is to some extent like marketing. You notice it when you get rid of it, but you don't really notice the work of the policy team or the advocacy team when they're actually at work. I have an example of when what happens when you start taking away budget from marketing, from my times at Ericsson. You would land in Stockholm Airport, and there was a corridor that would bring you out of the airport, which used to be full of Ericsson's ads. And at some point, someone decided that it was just too costly, and they decided to not to renew that rent. Well, guess what? The day after, one of our main competitors had ads throughout that corridor, and that didn't fly well when our CEO landed in Stockholm right after that happened. And I don't know exactly what happened. We rebought that space and probably paid much more than before for that. But that's really what happens when you take budget out of marketing. And it's kind of similar with policy work, right? It's work that happens often in the background, often behind closed doors, and you don't notice it until it's not there.
Right. No, exactly. Listening to you talk, the other thought that jumped in my mind that I guess I had been discounting is also the fact that not only are there maybe a lot more people who are users of technology rather than the innovators of technology, but those companies that are the users of technology are often much, much larger than those companies that are the innovators. And there's a lot of reasons for that, obviously, because I think the core reason is for the risk. If you're not willing to take risk, you really can't innovate. And if you're innovating, it's going to be incremental. If you're doing some of the really groundbreaking innovation, you have to be willing to take risk. You have to have an appetite for that. And that usually is not the profile of a large entity. I always joke around that Dilbert is funny because it's a documentary, right? That's the way you don't get ahead in a large company by taking any risk. So consequently, you have a lot of innovators doing really interesting stuff, taking real risk, and they tend to be smaller. So they just have a smaller voice. When you have like a company like you're saying, Sisvel is 100 or a couple hundred employees versus a Google, which is hundreds of thousands or millions of employees worldwide. It almost is unfair, I suppose, on some level in that regard. The innovator has to punch above their weight class. They have to. The other thing is I can't agree more. Like when it's gone, you don't realize what you had until it's gone. I mean, that probably fits on a whole bunch of different things and throughout life. But even like with people like you and me and others, constantly going to meetings, constantly meeting people, constantly networking. So this company has an issue. Well, now you know who to contact, who to call and say, hey, our CEO needs to get an audience, to give our point of view or to get this or to get that. Well, without you there knowing all the players and knowing all the people and knowing who to call and who should be in contact with, that doesn't happen. I mean, those things just don't fall out of the sky. They take effort.
Yeah, I can't agree more. I mean, I see companies that are increasing their budget in getting the right people in the discussion, in the policy discussion. I also see companies that are scaling back sometimes, which is unfortunate. There are also companies that go through a lot of changes internally in terms of their main strategy. You talk about very large companies. I don't discount the innovation that they do on the product market or on other technologies they develop, but yes, they use fundamental technologies that are developed through standardization, and standardization has proven to be extremely successful, but it requires very large investment and investments that happen often a decade before the standard becomes successful, and often investments in standards that do not become successful, because we always see the successful standards because they become global, they become widely adopted, but innovators spend money in R&D on areas that sometimes don't go anywhere, and standards that don't go anywhere. I'm old enough to remember WiMAX that tried to compete with LT. It went nowhere. And a lot of companies invested heavily in that standard. So that happens. But the investments happen well before the commercialization.
Yeah, it happens all the time that standards wind up not going anywhere. Technology is fickle mistress at times. You think you know what you've got, and then all of a sudden you don't have it for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it didn't play out, didn't scale quite the way you thought it would be. Sometimes somebody else comes out with a better technology that the market just decides to adopt that one. It's risky business. And I don't want to make it sound like that the folks who are the core implementers are not innovators. They innovate. They innovate a lot. They have a lot of patents. They hire a lot of people to innovate, I do think it's probably by and large fair to say that their innovation is more incremental or layered on the foundation of the innovators who are the first in class. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with incremental innovation. We don't get anywhere if we're not making things better step by step, but we also don't get there if we don't have the platform to start with. And those big companies just usually are not involved in the meaningful way, or certainly not the most meaningful way, in the platforms. Would you agree?
Well, I'll tell you an anecdote. I was in a licensing discussion some time ago with a car manufacturer that I will not name, and they were showing us a slide where they showed us a connected car and the infrastructure and all the innovation that that manufacturer specifically had put into both the car and the infrastructure side. And the infrastructure and the car were connected by a very tiny two-sided arrow at the bottom. And what they were explaining to us is, look, this is all the innovation that we brought into the automotive connected automotive market. Your technology is only this tiny little piece that connects the two things. Except that if you remove that tiny little things that connected the two things, none of the innovation on both sides, the infrastructure or the car itself, would work. None of that will have any impact on the consumer. And so the fundamental technology was that arrow that they put very tiny at the bottom. And they were trying to game the system and game the discussion by saying, and that's your only contribution to this all great thing that we did, which I'm not discounting, but again, it only exists because there is the telecommunication layer at the bottom that connects the two things.
That's funny. I mean, what comes to mind is simply like that's like building a highway on one side of the river and a highway on the other side of the river, and say, well, all you did is come up with the bridge. It's not such a big deal. It's like, well, it saves people from having to swim across. It actually connects things. It is interesting, and it's all to some extent. Look, I get it. This is a negotiation. It's a business. It's a business problem. I do think sometimes, me included, I think folks in the industry lose sight of that. It should shock no one that innovators want to get paid more and implementers want to pay less. I mean, that's just the nature of it. Goes all the way back to the first market 5,000 years ago, where you have vendors and purchasers and they're haggling, right? I mean, that's just the way that this goes. So it's not terribly shocking. What I do get disappointed with sometimes are the judges who I think should be able to look through what's going on a little bit more cleanly. I think in some parts of the world that they do, with a more level-headed, clear-eyed view of what's really going on, in terms of you just can't engage in this negotiation dance if you got one party that's not willing to negotiate, or their stated position, both privately and publicly, is we will never pay until the U.S. Supreme Court orders us to pay, or something like that, and it's just like, well, okay, how does that person fit into this equation where Frand is, we're offering you something fair and reasonable, but then if you say no, then why should you be entitled to anything that's fair and reasonable? We should just go back to patent damages, I would think.
I don't disagree. I think that there's got to be a recognition that behavior counts, right? Like some German courts do look at behavior. Some UK courts have looked at behavior in the past. I also sometimes look at this from a very practical point of view, and what's the danger of holdout. Assume I have a licensing program that charges $1 for my technology, for my patents in a specific market, except that 50% of the market is unlicensed because they hold out. Then what's my effective royalty rate? That's 50 cents. That's not $1. And it's 50 cents, and it's borne by 50% of the market who's actually paying. And so there is 50% of the market, I'm making numbers up, obviously. There is 50% of the market who's free riding on the other 50% to pay for the royalty. And not only they're free riding, they're basically competing also unfairly towards their own competitors, because they're not paying the royalties that the other competitors are paying. So I think we often talk too much about supra-friend rates in the SEP context. And I agree that it's a danger that courts should be aware of. We don't want to incentivize, supra-friend rates or higher rates than what really is supported by the market and what the technology is valued. But at the same time, there is never a discussion around what sub-friend rates would would imply. I was talking about the investments that innovators do sometimes a decade before the standard gets adopted. Well, the risk is that 10 years from now, there is going to be less investment in standardization. And 10 years from now, we're going to find out that the technologies are not as good as they could be, or there are more proprietary solutions because more players resort to proprietary solutions instead of sharing their technologies in the standardization setting. And so this is potentially a vicious cycle that is actually quite dangerous. And yes, I agree with you that I think judges should also take that into account, look at the reality of a market that potentially delays negotiation and delays payment, and what is the impact on the innovation ecosystem, and how can that be corrected? Is it through enhanced damages? Is it through what you're suggesting, that preemption should not apply if there is an unwilling licensee? I mean, at the end of the day, I think that without the use of the availability of injunction, it's very, very difficult for any rational player to say, okay, I will negotiate a license. I mean, many do, but ultimately that's the level playing field. If there is the availability of injunction, then a patent owner has the availability of the only tool that he has to enforce his property, which is an injunction, right? I mean, you are allowed to evict squatters from your apartment. Similarly, if you have intellectual property, you can't put fences around it. They're not self-enforceable. There's got to be a way to enforce those patents through exclusive remedies. That's one of the reasons that I think a lot of the court cases have gravitated towards Germany and the UPC lately, and not the US, where finally there is a debate around the need for injunction. And we see the USPTO doing, and the DOJ publishing statements and intervening in this discussion. And it's all very healthy. And there is a bill that has been proposed that is also very healthy. But the reality is that the state of the art is that injunctions are not readily available in the US. And therefore, many rational players just decide to wait until they get sued and sued again, and then go through many layers of adjudication.
Yeah, there's so many of us in the industry focus on the patent owner and then the implementer who won't pay or holds out or is unwilling, however you want to characterize them. But there's another layer there that this is just fundamentally anti-competitive that you touched on. Very important for people to always keep in mind. And I don't think it's 50% in the examples. I think there's a small number of players at the top of the market that take up, in most of these standard areas, a gigantic percentage of the overall market. So it's not probably 50%. In some of these markets, it's probably those small number of players take up 80% or even more of the market. And then what you have is you have the other players that are smaller than those mega international conglomerates. And they do take licenses because they probably can't afford to fight this in litigation for a decade. They want to put it aside and move forward with business and all those rational reasons that one would agree to a license. But they're immediately anti-competitive or non-competitive. It's an anti-competitive construct because if they're paying the innovator and then the giant companies at the top of the industry are not, the small company just is just going to take it in the short hairs. They can't help but be anti-competitive in their pricing compared to the big companies. And I wish regulators would look at that, because I think that's maybe not technically legally an antitrust problem, but boy, if the antitrust laws are there to do anything, it is to level the playing field and make sure you're not using your size to manipulate the market. And I look at the market, and I don't know how you can look at this and say that it's just not fundamentally manipulated by the large entities.
I think we can talk a lot about SMEs and the interest by regulators to SMEs, also because Sisvel has a number of initiatives really towards SMEs. But I think fundamentally there is sometimes a mistake to look at SMEs only from one side of this equation. Look at SMEs who only implement technologies, and forget about the many SMEs who actually do invest in the development of technologies and are innovators themselves. And the example that you were referring to applies very similarly on that side of the spectrum. We have, in our patent pools, we have worked in many ways with the smaller companies that are innovators and face the same uphill battle. How do you make sure that you can actually license your patent to a much bigger company using your patents? And so it is very difficult also for a company that does innovation, a small company that does innovation. There is also, in the recent years, there's been a huge debate around litigation financing and patent assertion entities who acquire patents to assert them in court. And they're often portrayed as these terrible actors that do harm to the market and to the consumer, while in fact, oftentimes, I don't have statistics, these are the only tools that an individual inventor, a small company has to actually enforce its patent and get paid for what they develop by a much larger company. Right? A smaller company will not have the means to go into court with a large company. Through litigation financing, they can do that by selling the portfolio to a company that has the pockets to go after this company. They can do that, and they can continue to innovate through that revenue stream that they can generate through the patent licensing. Absent that, they'll basically just go belly up, right? They don't have the means to continue. And a larger company can simply just infringe and step on those technology rights without caring, because they know that they can stay in litigation forever, and a smaller company cannot.
I just don't understand the animosity towards litigation funding. And I don't think people realize, what they're doing is they're fundamentally questioning the contingency relationship that has existed, at least in the US, which I'm very familiar with because I started my career as a litigator. Most people don't have the ability to go out and hire a lawyer by the hour. And you have a legal cause of action. I know you're going to collect something. I don't know how much you're going to collect, but I can evaluate the case and say that you've been injured. I'm willing to take your case for nothing, and I'll take a piece of what I recover. I mean, that happens every day, probably in every litigation firm across the country, in every city, every state, every courthouse on federal and state levels, right? It's just the way that industry works. Well, in this space where the cases are so big, they can take years, even if they're streamlined, even if there aren't any appeals, and even if there aren't any gaming of the timeline by the parties. It's going to take years and years. And it's a massive case. So a single law firm, even multiple law firms working together can't really offer contingency on that level the way that you can for a slip and fall, for example, or a car accident. Litigation funding plays the same exact role. It gives people access. Now, I get that there's been some high-profile nonsense by some of the litigation funders where the one that created a straw man to own the patents, didn't know anything about the technology, wasn't using them, operated, I think it was literally, he was a hot dog cart operator. Okay, look, that's action. That has nothing to do with the model of litigation funding. That has somebody just abused the litigation process, lied, whatever you want to call it, however you want to characterize it. And we got to be able to be adult enough to say, okay, well, we can understand when somebody's doing nefarious things with a model, and that one person does something nefarious with a business model does not make the business model nefarious. Again, it's the messaging. It's hard to, it feels like shoveling water into the ocean at times.
I'm old enough to remember the unfortunate email scam of Nigerian princes. And unfortunately, there were people who got scammed by those. We didn't kill the email system because there were fraud and there were bad actors, right? As you said, we tried to identify what those bad actors were. We tried to warn people against it, but that's not the whole system. That doesn't work. And ultimately, I've said that multiple times, a system with zero risk doesn't exist. There is nothing in life that carries zero risk, and companies operate under risk every day, all the time. Don't know what the price of oil will be tomorrow. If you're United Airlines, you care about that, but you can't predict that, and so on and so forth, right? So the idea that you can, and this is a very, very regulator point of view, the idea that you can actually not make a system better, but replace a system with something that in your mind will work much better without any flaws, without considering that there's going to be flaws in the new system anyway, it's very dangerous, especially when business are concerned. Take the American Banks Act. The premises were actually very, very good. They wanted to create an alternative to costly litigation for maybe smaller players to take advantage of that form. What they didn't anticipate was bad behavior that would be generated by this new tool that was the PTAB, and they didn't anticipate the complexity that would have created in the innovation ecosystem, especially to smaller inventors. This is similar to what was going on in Europe only a few months ago, where there was this proposal for regulation on standard essential patents. A bit of what our good friend Adam Mossoff calls the nirvana fallacy, the idea that there are inefficiencies in the system, therefore let's overhaul the system with something completely new that in theory will work flawlessly. And again, without considering that that new system will have other inefficiencies and that are even less tested than the inefficiencies that we have now. And again, I'm not against trying to correct the inefficiencies, and we can always make things better. But sometimes there is this approach by regulators that say, okay, we turn the page and we just start from scratch. We have a clean slate. Let's do this all over in a different way. And that's a bit aspirational and de facto not really doable.
So I have actually really no problem fundamentally with that approach, right? But if you're going to make that approach, you have to do it with an engineering mindset, which is to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to erase the board. We're going to start over. We're going to design a new system. Fine. What are the goals of this system? What do you want to try and accomplish? Well, what we were trying to do is streamline, cheaper, faster, and we're going to get rid of bad patents, whatever that means. Okay, put your wish list up on the whiteboard, right? This is what this system is designing to do. Pretty quickly, we realized that none of those things that we were told that this system was going to do, it was actually accomplishing. It was very efficient at getting rid of patents, all patents. It was slower than we anticipated because it wasn't really an alternative. All it became was additive. So that also meant it wasn't going to be any faster, and it certainly wasn't going to be any cheaper because you were just layering $500,000 to $1 million onto the cost of this dispute resolution and adding an extra 3 years usually, because they had to happen within 12 to 18 months, and then you have appeals to the federal circuit. And so it's longer, slower, more expensive. Okay, well, those are the exact opposite of what this system was intended to do. And we've known that for at least a decade. So what an engineer would have done is said, okay, well, let's erase the board, or maybe not erase the entire board and say, okay, well, what's going wrong here? And let's fix it. And that's never happened. And I think the engineering mindset would have looked at the system that we had in place and say, how can we, without throwing it all away, because we don't want to introduce risk and problems that we're not aware of, that we're going to be stepping into, how do we tweak this? And the problem is when you do try and erase the board and start all over new, people like you and me, we object just fundamentally because we know once that happens, there will be no revisiting of this for probably a generation because it's a major change. And when there's no revisiting, whatever's wrong is just going to be something we're going to have to live with. And that's, I think, what happened.
I agree with what you said, but I would even go one step back with my engineering mind and say, first, you need to look at whether there is a market failure. You need to do a market assessment, and a concrete one and a thorough one, to see if there is a market failure. Because if there isn't a market failure, markets and industries are very, very good at solving inefficiencies on their own without any regulation to be needed. And you see it in many of the things that have been developed throughout the years in SEPs. Like patent pools are one example, right? We want to reduce frictions between licensors and licensees. We recognize that there are many, many patents that are essential to a standard, and therefore aggregating them makes some sense. If you are an IoT manufacturer, you know that you can take one single license to a large percentage of the SEPs out there through a pool. And so, again, going back to your point is absolutely correct. But before, let's identify the problem instead of starting from the solution, which is oftentimes what we hear and what we see in many parts of the world, that they propose solutions in search for a problem. But then to the extent that there are problems, are those systemic problems that require regulation, or are those just inefficiencies that ultimately the market will self-correct?
I agree. I'll take another step. I think that the problems with the system that needed to be addressed were specifically the ones that were left unaddressed. And what needed to happen to the system, in my view, where I thought we originally were going, was to streamline this. You have district courts, you have at the time re-examination, inter partes ex parte re-examination at the patent office, you have ITC, and you have different standards across the board that apply to what is supposed to be an asset, a property right. And I'm not just before it issues, I'm talking about different ways and different standards that apply to the same exact rights, depending on forum, depending upon challenge. That was begging for streamlining because it created a redundancy, it created an arbitrage. And rather than addressing that and streamlining the system and carving out the redundancies and harmonizing what we already had, what you did is you added additional arbitrage opportunities with different standards still yet. Again, nobody will ever convince me otherwise. All these different standards to institute a challenge of a patent. The question is, does the person who has decision-making authority want to take a look at this patent or not? And if they do, they will. It doesn't matter whether it's substantial new question or reasonable likelihood or probability or whatever, however you say it. Do you think this patent should be looked at again? And unfortunately, when you hire a bunch of people who are told that your job is to get rid of bad patents, well, what do you see everywhere? You see bad patents everywhere. It's the old, if you are a hammer, the world looks like a nail. But I want to, before we run out of time here today, I wanted to ask you about patent pools, because you've mentioned it a couple times. I know what they are. Probably many of the people listening know what they are. But what is the, elevator pitch explanation of what is a patent pool for those who are not familiar?
Yeah, so patent pools are simply an aggregation of standard essential patents around a specific standard. Standard essential patents that are often owned by different parties. And therefore, they're efficient because instead of having to negotiate with multiple parties a license for the use of the SEPs, an implementer can simply come to a patent pool and take a single license to a pool of these patents. And antitrust authorities around the world have confirmed that they're pro-competitive because they help the market, they help ultimately consumers in reducing transaction costs. At Sisvel, we've been operating in this space since 1982. Our founder founded Sisvel in 1982, and just to put this into perspective as to how big of a vision Roberto Dini, our founder, had, Sisvel was founded before the Federal Circuit even existed. Sisvel was founded on April 1st, exactly 6 years after Apple was founded. So this was the vision that he had back then. And we've grown ever since to continue to serve the market and serve our licensors and licensees. We call it the inventive loop because we give our patent owners the opportunity to reinvest in R&D, and we have distributed billions in the year that have been reinvested in R&D. But we also reduce the frictions with licensees, with implementers, because we offer a solution that is simple and efficient. Many of our pools, in fact, have as licensors who are also implementers of the technology and therefore become also licensees of the pool, which speaks to the balance of the tool. One thing that I want to point out is the fact that we go back to what you were saying, that what judges should look at and what regulators should look at. First, patent pools are an industry solutions that have been proven to work. And second, I think we need to look carefully at those actors who refuse to take a license from a pool that has achieved critical mass, both in terms of licensees and licensors. We go back to my example of the 50 cents, right? If there is a pool that has critical mass of licensors, has enough standard essential patents in the license, and has a critical mass of licensees, has licensed a significant percentage of the market, well, those who are refusing to even engage in negotiation for a license through a patent pool and don't negotiate bilaterally with the participant of the pool, well, that to me speaks loudly of unfairness towards those who are paying. And I think judges and regulators should start looking at that carefully because, again, delay only helps those potential licensees who are not taking a license and hurts not only the patent owners, but hurts those who are actually paying for a license.
So in a nutshell, a patent pool is very similar to what probably many people are familiar with from the music side of the world and ASCAP and BMI, right? It collects a bunch of different rights. You want those rights or any piece of those rights. You make a single payment to an entity, And then that entity then figures out through the formulas that all the patent owners have agreed to who gets what percentage of the revenue that's coming in for this particular pool. And it's extremely efficient, and it has the benefit of being entirely transparent, right? I mean, this is not a situation where you go and you're like, okay, well, how much money do you have in your pocket? Okay, well, I want all of that for this pool. It's no, the rates are set. People know what the rates are. The formulas are set. They know what the patent owners are getting into with the formula. It works because it's understandable, it's clean, and nothing's hidden.
And if you go on our website, you'll see that for most of our programs, you have very, very clear and transparent terms. You can see the royalty rates, you can see the patent owners, you can see a list of patents that have been evaluated as essential. So you know what you're getting and you know how much it costs. And so speaking of transparency and predictability, pool seems to be really sort of a no-brainer. And again, they should be endorsed by regulators as well as, again, an industry solution that has been proven to work and works for consumers.
Yeah, not just allowed, but endorsed. They really should be endorsed because they're just efficient. They work for everybody. The streamlining I was just complaining about on the enforcement stuff, the patent pools is like the absolute opposite of that. It is streamlined. It works. It's clean. It's certain from the acquirer because you have what you're getting, how much it's going to cost. You can factor that in. I would like to see greater use of patent pools, period. Let me also ask you about this because I think it relates to patent pools. Maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't, let me know. But you just published an article recently on IPWatchdog about an initiative that Sisvel has been involved with WIPO, and you guys have, I don't know whether you say partner or whether you're giving WIPO some of your information or you're helping WIPO. I'll let you characterize it, but there's something interesting going on there I'd like you to explain to the audience.
So on our website, we routinely have lists of patents that are evaluated by a third-party independent evaluator as essential towards the standard. So it's already available on our website. And this is a WIPO initiative that basically is interested in integrating some of that information into their patent database called PatentScope. And we were very happy to be the first one to participate to this initiative and provide WIPO with the data in a format that was usable from their side better than just a web page. What I put in that article, and people can certainly read on IPWatchdog, is a little bit of an explanation of the disconnect between a patent list from our web page and the universe of standard essential patents. In essence, what I mean by that is that a patent list can only be limited inevitably for multiple reasons, because of cost, because you can't evaluate every single SEP that you own on a specific technology, because of resources. You might not know all the SEPs that you have. That's common, for example, for a small company. They don't have the resources to mine their whole portfolio. And ultimately, the list is indicative and exemplary of what the license offers, but the license is not limited to those patents in that list, right? The license is omnicomprehensive, covers every SEP owned by the participating patent owner on a specific technology, on a specific product. So the licensees get the peace of mind that they get an omnicomprehensive license. So the list is inevitably incomplete. That's what I try to explain in that article. It's still indicative of what the patent pool offers, and we feel that giving that integration to PatentScope enhances the visibility of our patent pools and other patents that have been licensed and are licensed through our patent pool. So that is just another avenue that licensees can find a way to contact us and get in touch with us for a license and know what patents are included in what pools. So that's basically what the article is about. It's a step towards transparency, but it's a transparency that was already there in the sense that on our website there is already that information. It's just in a different format and it's more searchable.
Yeah, it's more accessible. It's out there. It exists somewhere. Like that's the thing. Like going back to we've been talking about the PTAB. This irritates me about the PTAB. They put all their decisions out, right? But they're not really out in a way that is meaningfully searchable. I mean, it is what it is. It's not like they're necessarily trying to hide things, but there's a difference between transparency and accessibility. And I think this takes what has already been transparent and enhances to a much greater extent, the accessibility of that information. And for those who are interested in that article, the title of the article is Enhancing Transparency in SEPs, the Sisvel WIPO PatentScope Initiative. And if you can't remember that, you could just go to IP Watchdog. And the way I just found it here very quickly is I searched using our search tool and put in WIPO, PatentScope, Sisvel, and it's the first article that came up. It was published on April 14. Well, Matteo, I really appreciate this conversation. I think it's been great. Is there anything that you maybe wanted to let people know that we haven't talked about yet before I let you go?
I mean, back on transparency and what we were discussing before on small and medium enterprises. Again, SMEs are often used as a tool to push regulation. SMEs are an important part of the economy, and they're both innovators and users of the technology, as we said. And at Sisvel, we do recognize that SMEs are sometimes at a disadvantage when it comes to licensing their patents or licensing somebody else's patents. And so we have created a number of initiatives intended to close the asymmetry gap when SMEs are involved. And there's been multiple announcements of multiple initiatives, for example, a mediation pledge at WIPO, that we signed with other larger patent owners. But more recently, an initiative that has taken quite a bit of airtime, and we're very happy to see that has got good response, is a so-called IoT fund. It's a fund that we have established, and we've set it up ourselves. Sisvel pays for this fund, where we want to incentivize SMEs to take a license through our IoT pool while they test the technology, right? An SME might try to figure out if the technology is the right technology for their products. And so what the fund does, it pays for the royalties for an SME, and the SME, we use the EU definition because it's broadly used. And they basically get a license that they don't have to pay a dime for, to one of our largest pool in terms of patent owners, for 2 years, up to a maximum of 2,000 products. So that basically gives them a sandbox to be fully licensed for 2 years, try the technology out, and if that works for them because they exceed the number of products because they're successful, or if they use it longer than 2 years, which again means that they're probably successful and the technology works for them, then they will take a license. But until then, they pay nothing. That has become quite a successful initiative. We launched it at the end of last year. And in a mere 3 months, we have already signed one license with an SME, and we're in talk with many that are interested in coming in. And so I just want to highlight it. It's on our website. It's something that is useful. And if you're an SME and use IoT technology, that's certainly something that you should be aware of.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess I was not aware that you guys were doing that, but that's fantastic. I know any business owner, everybody knows that one of the things, there's switching costs are real, but before you even get to switching costs, you often don't even know that what you're about to try and acquire, whether it works for what you need it to do, or whether you can make it work within your system. So the opportunity to have a sandbox, as you call it, to see whether this works for you, it makes it much easier for people to try things out. And then also, it doesn't lock them in that with a huge financial investment that maybe ultimately didn't provide any rewards for them, or they couldn't use or couldn't maximize. And I also think it's brilliant business as well. How can you argue it's free? So you're essentially partnering with SMEs to help them get across the finish line to a place where you both benefit. And I think that's genius. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's great. I appreciate you coming and having this conversation. It was good. When's the next time we're going to get to see you in America? Do you know yet? I know we just saw you at IP Watchdog Live, which was great to see you. You have any other travel plans to come back this way?
I have travel plans, too many, probably coming up. I can't tell you when I'm going to be in DC, but it's going to be soon. I always would love to come back, and I have so many friends out there. So I'll see you soon.
All right, Matteo, thank you so much.
Gene, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to IP Watchdog Unleashed. We will be back next week, and we hope you will join us again. In the meantime, please be sure to visit IPWatchdog.com to read all the latest news and information about what is happening in the intellectual property world. And also be sure to subscribe to our free daily email newsletter.